Sarah Mitchell stared at the wedding invitation in her trembling hands. The elegant gold lettering spelled out her doom in fancy script. In 3 weeks she would marry Dr. Alexander Hartwell, a man she had met exactly twice. Both meetings had been disasters. The first time was at a charity gala where her father had dragged her along to network with important people. Alexander had barely looked at her, spending most of the evening on his phone discussing medical procedures with someone. When her father introduced them, Alexander had given her a brief handshake and said, "Nice dress," before turning back to his conversation. Sarah had felt invisible, like a piece of furniture in an expensive room. The second meeting was even worse. Her father had arranged a dinner at the country club, claiming it was just a family gathering. Sarah arrived to find Alexander already there, checking his watch every few minutes. He had ordered for her without asking what she wanted, assuming she would want the salmon because most women prefer fish. When she mentioned she was vegetarian, he had rolled his eyes and called the waiter back with obvious irritation. Now, sitting in her small apartment above the flower shop she managed, Sarah wondered how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. 6 months ago, everything had been different. She had been planning to expand the flower business, maybe even open a second location. She had been dating Tom, a kind teacher who made her laugh and brought her coffee every morning. Life had been simple and happy. Then her father's construction company went bankrupt overnight. A major client had defaulted on payments, leaving them with millions in debt and no way to pay their workers. Her father had aged 10 years in a single week, his hair turning gray as he faced losing everything he had built over 30 years. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Alexander Hartwell needed a wife. Not for love, but for appearances. His wealthy grandmother was dying, and had threatened to leave her massive fortune to charity unless Alexander settled down and proved he could be responsible for more than just his medical practice. The old woman had grown tired of reading about his playboy lifestyle in gossip magazines. Sarah's father had somehow learned about this through his business connections. Alexander needed respectability, and Sarah's family needed money. The arrangement was brutally simple. Sarah would marry Alexander for 2 years, play the perfect doctor's wife at social events, and in return, Alexander would pay off all of her father's debts and give her family enough money to start fresh. The flower shop bell chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Mrs. Rodriguez, one of her regular customers, entered with a warm smile. "Good morning, dear. I need something special for my granddaughter's graduation." Sarah forced herself to focus on work, arranging white roses and baby's breath while Mrs. Rodriguez chatted about her family. This was what she would miss most: the personal connections, the joy of creating something beautiful for people's special moments. After the wedding, she would have to give up the shop. Alexander had made it clear that his wife would not work in retail. She would be expected to volunteer with the right charities and attend the right social events. As she worked, Sarah thought about Tom. She had broken up with him 2 weeks ago without explaining why. How could she tell him that she was selling herself to save her family? Tom had been confused and hurt, asking what he had done wrong. Sarah had lied and said she didn't love him anymore, watching his face crumble as she spoke. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she couldn't drag him into this mess. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father, meeting with Hartwell's lawyer this afternoon. "Don't be late." Sarah sighed and finished the arrangement for Mrs. Rodriguez. The legal meeting would finalize all the contract details. She felt like she was signing away her soul. That afternoon, Sarah sat in a glass conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper. Alexander was there in an expensive suit, looking more like a CEO than a doctor. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Ms. Chen, spread papers across the mahogany table. "The prenuptial agreement is straightforward," Ms. Chen explained in a crisp voice. "Mrs. Hartwell will receive a monthly allowance for personal expenses, but all major purchases must be approved. She will attend all required social functions and maintain the appropriate public image. Any breach of contract will result in immediate termination of the financial arrangement." Sarah's father nodded eagerly at every clause, but Sarah felt sick. She was being bought like a piece of property. Alexander hadn't even looked at her since she arrived. He spent the entire meeting scrolling through emails on his tablet. "There's one more thing," Ms. Chen continued. "The marriage must appear genuine to Mrs. Hartwell Sr. She's a sharp woman who won't be fooled by obvious fakery." You'll need to live together and present a united front at all family gatherings. This was news to Sarah. She had assumed they would live separately, meeting only for public events. The thought of sharing a home with Alexander made her stomach clench with anxiety. After the papers were signed and her father had left with a relieved smile, Sarah found herself alone with Alexander in the elevator. For the first time all day, he actually looked at her. "I know this isn't ideal for either of us," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "but I want you to know that I'll respect your privacy. The house is large enough that we won't have to see each other much." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She wanted to ask him why he couldn't just find someone to love him for real, why he was willing to fake a marriage for money. But the elevator doors opened before she could find the courage. Walking back to her flower shop in the fading afternoon light, Sarah realized that in 3 weeks, her entire life would change forever. She would become Mrs. Alexander Hartwell, trapped in a world of wealth and pretense where her feelings didn't matter. The only question was whether she would be strong enough to survive 2 years of living a lie, or if the experience would destroy the person she used to be. The wedding day arrived like a storm Sarah couldn't escape. She stood in the bridal suite of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, staring at herself in an ornate mirror. The dress was beautiful, ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves, but it felt like a costume for a role she didn't want to play. Her mother bustled around the room, adjusting flowers and fussing with Sarah's veil. "You look absolutely stunning, sweetheart," she said. But Sarah could hear the forced cheerfulness in her voice. Her mother knew this wasn't what either of them had dreamed of for Sarah's wedding day. The ceremony was a carefully orchestrated performance. The church was filled with Alexander's colleagues, wealthy socialites, and business associates. Sarah recognized almost no one on the guest list. Her own friends had been told it was a small, intimate ceremony, another lie in the growing collection. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Sarah caught sight of Alexander waiting at the altar. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, but his expression was unreadable. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod, as if they were business partners about to close a deal. The ceremony passed in a blur of meaningless words. Sarah repeated the vows without really hearing them, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. When Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch was gentle but impersonal. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and passionless, performed for the audience rather than any feeling between them. The reception was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, decorated with white roses and gold accents. Everything was perfect and cold, like a beautiful photograph with no life behind it. Sarah smiled and thanked guests for their congratulations, playing her part while feeling completely empty inside. During the first dance, Alexander held her appropriately close and led her through the steps with practiced precision. "You're doing well," he murmured near her ear. "My grandmother seems pleased." Sarah glanced toward the head table where Mrs. Hartwell Sr. sat watching them with sharp, calculating eyes. The old woman was elegant and intimidating, her silver hair perfectly styled and her jewelry worth more than Sarah's family had ever owned. She had spoken to Sarah only briefly before the ceremony, studying her like she was examining a questionable investment. "She's scary," Sarah whispered back to Alexander as they turned across the dance floor. For the first time since she had known him, Alexander almost smiled. "She is, but she's fair. If you can win her approval, the next 2 years will be much easier." After the dance, Sarah was swept into a whirlwind of introductions. Alexander's colleagues were polite but distant, clearly unsure what to make of his sudden marriage to someone outside their social circle. The wives were worse, smiling sweetly while their eyes judged everything from Sarah's background to her dress to her conversation skills. Mrs. Patricia Blackwood, the wife of a prominent surgeon, cornered Sarah by the dessert table. "How refreshing to meet someone so authentic," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alexander has always been drawn to charity cases." Sarah felt her cheeks burn but forced herself to respond graciously. "Alexander and I share many interests," she said. Though she couldn't think of a single thing they had in common, the evening dragged on endlessly. Sarah's feet ached in her designer shoes and her face hurt from fake smiling. She watched Alexander work the room with ease, charming donors for the hospital foundation and discussing cases with fellow doctors. He was clearly in his element, while she felt like an actress who had forgotten her lines. Finally, the reception ended and guests began to leave. Sarah's parents hugged her goodbye, her mother whispering, "Call me tomorrow," with tears in her eyes. Her father patted her shoulder awkwardly and said, "You're doing the right thing, sweetheart." Alexander's driver took them to his house, now her house too, in the exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood. The mansion was everything Sarah had expected, imposing, elegant, and intimidating. 3 stories of brick and marble with perfectly manicured gardens and windows that gleamed like watching eyes. Inside, the house was a museum of expensive taste. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, oil paintings in heavy frames lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light over furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything was beautiful and untouchable, like Alexander himself. "Maria, our housekeeper, prepared the master suite for you," Alexander said, his tone businesslike again. "I've moved my things to the study down the hall. You'll have complete privacy." Sarah nodded, feeling smaller with each step up the grand staircase. The master bedroom was larger than her entire old apartment, decorated in soft blues and creams with a 4-poster bed that could sleep 6 people. Fresh flowers, white orchids, sat on the dresser, and her few belongings looked lost in the enormous walk-in closet. Alexander paused in the doorway. "There are some things we should discuss about living arrangements," he said. "I usually leave for the hospital by 6 in the morning and often don't return until late evening. Maria handles all the household management, but she'll need to know your preferences for meals and schedules." "I don't really have preferences," Sarah said quietly. "I'm not used to having someone cook and clean for me." Something flickered across Alexander's face. Surprise, maybe, or discomfort. "Well, you'll adjust. There's also the matter of social obligations. My secretary, Jennifer, will coordinate your schedule. There are several charity events and dinner parties in the coming weeks where your presence will be expected." Sarah sat heavily on the edge of the enormous bed. The wedding dress suddenly felt unbearably heavy, like armor that didn't fit properly. "What am I supposed to talk about at these events? I don't know anything about your world." Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, disturbing his perfect styling for the first time all day. "You'll learn. Jennifer can provide background information on the people and causes. Most conversations at these events are fairly superficial anyway." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the silence of her new prison. The room was beautiful but cold, like everything else in this new life. She thought about her small apartment above the flower shop, with its mismatched furniture and plants crowding every windowsill. It had been cramped and sometimes noisy from the street below, but it had been hers. She walked to the window and looked out at the perfectly landscaped garden. In the distance, she could see the lights of downtown Boston, where her old life continued without her. Tom was probably grading papers in his small apartment, maybe wondering why she had really left him. Her assistant was probably closing up the flower shop, dealing with the late customers who always seemed to appear just as she was locking up. Sarah changed out of the wedding dress and hung it carefully in the closet, knowing she would probably never wear it again. In her simple nightgown, she felt more like herself, but even that comfort was temporary. Tomorrow she would have to learn how to be Mrs. Alexander Hartwell, a woman who existed only on paper and in public appearances. She climbed into the enormous bed and lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, Alexander was probably working late, reading medical journals or reviewing patient files. They were married now, bound together by legal documents and financial necessity. But they were still complete strangers, sharing a house and a name they both wore like disguises. 3 months into their marriage, Sarah had perfected the art of being invisible in her own home. She had learned Alexander's schedule down to the minute. He left at 5:45 each morning and returned between 8 and 10 at night, depending on his surgery schedule. They passed like ghosts in their own hallways, exchanging polite greetings when their paths crossed. The social events had become routine torture. Sarah attended charity galas, hospital fundraisers, and dinner parties where she smiled appropriately and made small talk about causes she barely understood. Jennifer, Alexander's efficient secretary, had indeed provided her with background information, but Sarah still felt like she was reading from a script in a language she didn't quite speak. At the monthly meeting of the Women's Hospital Auxiliary, Sarah sat at a polished conference table surrounded by women who had been born into wealth. They discussed their upcoming charity auction with the casual ease of people who had never worried about money. Sarah, "Darling," said Mrs. Pemberton, the committee chair, "we'd love to have Alexander donate a medical consultation for the auction." "I'm sure he'd be happy to help." Sarah nodded and smiled. "I'll certainly ask him," she said, though she had no idea how to bring up the subject. Their conversations rarely went beyond discussing household schedules and upcoming events. After the meeting, Sarah found herself walking through Boston Common instead of going straight home. The autumn air was crisp, and families were scattered across the grass enjoying the afternoon sunshine. She sat on a bench and watched children play while their parents chatted nearby. This was the life she had always imagined for herself: simple, warm, real. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How are you doing, honey?" "Dad says the flower shop sold to a nice family. They're keeping all the employees." Sarah's heart clenched. Her flower shop, her little sanctuary, was gone. She had signed the papers last week, transferring ownership to cover the remaining debts her father's construction company couldn't handle. The new owners seemed kind, but it still felt like losing a piece of her soul. She typed back, "I'm fine. Glad the shop is in good hands." That evening, Sarah arrived home to find Alexander in the kitchen, which was unusual. He was standing at the island with a cup of coffee, still wearing his surgical scrubs. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "Long day?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. He nodded, rubbing his temples. Emergency surgery that ran 6 hours longer than expected. The patient was a 7-year-old girl. His voice was strained in a way she had never heard before. Sarah poured herself a glass of water, unsure what to say. She had learned that Alexander was a pediatric neurosurgeon, specializing in the most difficult cases, but he never talked about his work. "Did everything go well?" she asked hesitantly. Alexander looked at her with surprise, as if he had forgotten she was there. "Yes, she'll make a full recovery. Her parents—" He stopped and shook his head. "They were so young, barely older than us." For a moment, Sarah saw something vulnerable in his expression, a crack in the polished facade he always maintained. Then he seemed to catch himself and straightened up. "I should let you know," he said, his tone returning to business. "We've been invited to my grandmother's birthday celebration next weekend. It's important that we attend together." Sarah nodded. "Of course. Should I know anything special about what she expects?" Alexander studied her for a moment. "She's been asking questions about you, about us. She wants to have lunch with you this week." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Just me?" "Just you. Thursday at 1 o'clock at her club." Alexander's expression was unreadable. "Be yourself, but remember what's at stake." Thursday arrived too quickly. Sarah stood outside the exclusive Beacon Club, trying to calm her nerves. The building was old Boston elegance personified, with brass fixtures and doormen who looked like they had been there since the Revolutionary War. Mrs. Hartwell Sr. was waiting in the dining room, seated at a table by the window with a perfect view of the harbor. She was even more intimidating in daylight, her silver hair impeccably styled and her jewelry understated but obviously expensive. "Sarah, dear," she said as Sarah approached. "How lovely to see you again. Please sit down." The meal started pleasantly enough, with conversation about the weather and the club's renovations, but as they ate their salads, Mrs. Hartwell's questions became more pointed. "Tell me about your family, dear. Your father's business, I understand, faced some difficulties?" Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "Yes, but everything is resolved now." "I'm sure it is." Mrs. Hartwell's tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. "And your relationship with my grandson? How did you meet?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading. She had practiced the story with Jennifer, but sitting across from Alexander's grandmother made it harder to lie convincingly. "Through mutual friends," Sarah said, sticking to the script. "We discovered we had a lot in common." "Such as?" Sarah's mind went blank. What did she and Alexander have in common? She barely knew him well enough to say what he liked for breakfast. "We both care about helping others," she said finally. "Alexander through his medical practice and I through community service." Mrs. Hartwell smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How wonderful. And you're happy together?" "Very happy," Sarah lied. After lunch, Mrs. Hartwell walked her to the club's entrance. "Sarah, may I speak frankly with you?" Sarah's stomach dropped, but she nodded. "I've lived for 87 years, dear, and I've learned to read people quite well. I know a marriage of convenience when I see one." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Hartwell held up a hand. "Let me finish. I don't care why you married Alexander, but I do care about what happens next." My grandson is a brilliant surgeon and a good man, but he's forgotten how to let people care about him. He's built walls around himself that keep everyone at a distance. She studied Sarah with those sharp eyes. The question is whether you're brave enough to try to tear those walls down, or whether you're content to live as strangers for the rest of your arrangement. Sarah felt tears threatening. I don't know how to reach him. We barely know each other. Then get to know him, Mrs. Hartwell said simply. Real marriage isn't about grand gestures or perfect compatibility. It's about choosing to care for someone every day, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. That night, Sarah lay in her enormous bed thinking about Mrs. Hartwell's words. She had spent 3 months avoiding Alexander, maintaining the polite distance they had both seemed to prefer. But maybe the old woman was right. Maybe there was more to Alexander than the cold, arrogant man she had married. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She woke up early and went downstairs to find Alexander in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading medical journals before leaving for work. Good morning, she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. He looked up, surprised to see her awake so early. Morning. How did lunch with my grandmother go? Sarah sat down across from him at the kitchen island. She's an interesting woman. Very direct, Alexander almost smiled. That's one way to put it. What did she want to know? About us. About whether we're really happy together. Alexander's expression became guarded. What did you tell her? Sarah looked directly into his eyes. I told her we were very happy, but I think she knew I was lying. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander closed his medical journal and really looked at her for the first time since their wedding day. What are you saying, Sarah? I'm saying maybe we should try to actually get to know each other. We're going to be living together for 2 years. It might be easier if we were at least friends. Alexander studied her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Friends, he repeated slowly. Friends, Sarah confirmed. What do you think? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I think my grandmother is more perceptive than I gave her credit for. The friendship experiment began awkwardly. Sarah started joining Alexander for coffee in the mornings, and their conversations were stilted at first, filled with long pauses and careful politeness. But gradually something began to shift. She learned that Alexander had become a doctor because his younger brother had died of brain cancer when they were children. He had been only 8 years old when 12-year-old Michael passed away, and he had spent his entire life since then trying to save other people's brothers and sisters. I remember sitting in those hospital waiting rooms, he told her one morning, staring into his coffee cup. Watching parents get the worst news of their lives, I decided I never wanted to be helpless like that again. Sarah began to understand why he seemed so distant at social events. He didn't care about the cocktail parties and charity galas because his real work happened in operating rooms, fighting to save lives that mattered to someone the way Michael had mattered to him. In return, Sarah shared stories about her flower shop, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful for people's important moments. She told him about Mrs. Rodriguez, who bought flowers every week for her late husband's grave, and about the young man who had spent an hour choosing the perfect bouquet to propose to his girlfriend. I miss the personal connections, she admitted. At these social events, everyone talks, but no one really says anything meaningful. Alexander nodded. I know what you mean. Most of the people at those parties have never had to worry about anything more serious than which wine to serve at dinner. They began eating dinner together when Alexander's schedule allowed. Maria, the housekeeper, seemed pleased by this development and started preparing meals clearly designed for 2 people, instead of whatever Alexander could grab between surgeries. One evening, Alexander came home particularly late, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Sarah was reading in the living room when she heard him in the kitchen, rummaging through cabinets. Looking for something? She asked from the doorway. He turned, startled. Just some aspirin. Long day. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way he held himself like someone carrying an invisible weight. Bad case? Alexander hesitated, then sat heavily at the kitchen island. 10-year-old boy. Tumor in a location that makes surgery extremely risky. The family wants me to operate, but the chances of success are maybe 30%. If it goes wrong, he could be paralyzed or worse. Sarah poured him a glass of water and found the aspirin. What will you do? I don't know yet. I need to review all the scans again, maybe consult with colleagues in other cities. He rubbed his temples. The hardest part is that he reminds me of Michael. Same age, same smile when he's trying to be brave. Without thinking, Sarah reached out and gently touched his shoulder. Alexander looked up at her, surprised by the contact, but he didn't pull away. "You'll figure out the right thing to do," she said softly. "You always do. How can you be so sure? You barely know me? I know enough. I know you care about your patients more than yourself. I know you work 18-hour days because every life matters to you. I know you become a different person when you talk about helping children." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "I never expected," he started, then stopped. "Expected what?" "I never expected you to actually see me. I thought we would just go through the motions for 2 years and then go our separate ways." Sarah felt her heart skip. Maybe we don't have to just go through the motions. Their friendship deepened over the following weeks. Alexander began sharing more about his work, and Sarah found herself genuinely fascinated by the complexity of his cases. She started researching pediatric neurosurgery so she could better understand what he was talking about. In return, Alexander began asking about her interests. He discovered that she had studied botany in college before taking over the flower shop, and he encouraged her to consider going back to school or finding work with a botanical garden. "You light up when you talk about plants," he observed one morning. "It's completely different from how you look at those charity events." "Those events aren't really me," Sarah admitted. "I still feel like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's life." "Then stop playing dress-up. Be yourself." At the next hospital fundraiser, Sarah surprised everyone by actually enjoying herself. Instead of making polite small talk, she asked genuine questions about the hospital's programs. She found herself in a passionate conversation with Dr. Martinez, the head of pediatric oncology, about the healing power of garden therapy for young patients. Alexander watched from across the room as Sarah animated conversation with several doctors and nurses. For the first time at one of these events, her smile looked genuine. When she caught his eye and grinned at him, he felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Later that night, as they drove home together, Sarah was still energized from the evening. "Did you know the hospital has been wanting to create a therapeutic garden for the children's ward for years?" she said excitedly. "They just haven't had anyone with the botanical knowledge to design it properly." Alexander glanced at her as he navigated the late-night traffic. "You're thinking about volunteering to design it." "I might be." "Would that be appropriate? I mean, would people think it's strange that your wife wants to get her hands dirty with actual work?" The word wife hung between them for a moment. It was the first time either of them had used the term naturally in conversation, without the artificial formality they usually maintained. "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that people would be impressed that my wife has genuine expertise in something that could help children heal." The therapeutic garden project became Sarah's passion. She threw herself into researching plants that would thrive in a hospital environment while providing sensory stimulation for young patients. She worked with the hospital's child life specialist to understand what kinds of spaces would be most beneficial. Alexander found himself looking forward to her updates each evening, watching her face light up as she described her plans for different sections of the garden. She had found her purpose again, and he was amazed by the transformation in her confidence and energy. One evening, as Sarah spread botanical catalogs across the dining room table, Alexander sat down to help her choose between different varieties of lavender. "This one has a stronger fragrance," she explained, pointing to a photograph, "but this variety is more resilient in our climate." As she leaned over the table to show him something, her hair brushed against his hand. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he realized that somewhere along the way, his feelings for Sarah had changed completely. She wasn't just the woman he had married for convenience anymore. She was Sarah, who worried about his long surgeries and made sure he ate proper meals. She was the woman who had seen past his arrogance to understand why he had become a doctor. She was becoming essential to his daily happiness in ways he hadn't anticipated. The realization scared him more than any surgery he had ever performed. "Sarah," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up from the catalogs. "Yes?" He studied her face, seeing the woman she had become over the past few months instead of the stranger he had married. "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, his phone rang with the urgent tone that meant a medical emergency. He looked at the caller ID and sighed. "I have to take this. Emergency surgery." As he left to save another life, Sarah watched him go and wondered what he had been about to say. The air between them had felt charged with possibility, Like the moment before lightning strikes, she was beginning to suspect that their arrangement had become something neither of them had planned for, something that might be harder to walk away from when their 2 years were up. The therapeutic garden was taking shape beautifully, but Sarah barely noticed her success. For 3 weeks, Alexander had been different, distant again, like he was rebuilding the walls between them. Ever since the night he had started to tell her something important, he had been polite but careful, avoiding the easy intimacy they had developed. Sarah couldn't understand what had changed. They still had coffee together in the mornings, but Alexander buried himself in medical journals instead of talking. Their dinner conversations had returned to safe topics like household schedules and upcoming events. The warmth that had been growing between them seemed to have vanished overnight. At the same time, something else was troubling her. Sarah had been feeling dizzy and nauseous for the past week, exhausted in a way that didn't make sense given how much sleep she was getting. She had assumed it was stress from the garden project and the tension with Alexander, but when she nearly fainted while reviewing plant deliveries at the hospital, Dr. Martinez insisted she see someone in the emergency department. The young resident who examined her asked routine questions about her symptoms, then requested a blood test, just to rule out a few things. Sarah waited in the small examination room, assuming they would tell her she was anemic or fighting off a virus. When Dr. Martinez returned instead of the resident, Sarah knew something was wrong. The older doctor sat down with a gentle expression that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Sarah, the blood test revealed something unexpected," she said carefully. "You're pregnant." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's impossible," she whispered. Dr. Martinez consulted the chart. "You're about 6 weeks along." "I know this might be surprising, but..." "No, you don't understand," Sarah interrupted, her voice shaking. "Alexander and I, we haven't..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't explain that their marriage was a business arrangement and they had never been intimate. Except that wasn't entirely true anymore, was it? 6 weeks ago would have been right around the time they had started becoming friends. Sarah's mind raced back to that night when Alexander had come home exhausted from the difficult surgery. She had comforted him, and later they had shared a bottle of wine while talking about their childhoods. She remembered feeling closer to him than she ever had before. She remembered the way he had looked at her when she told him about her dreams for the future, and she remembered how the evening had ended, with Alexander walking her to her bedroom door, both of them lingering in the hallway, the air thick with unspoken feelings. What happened next was a blur of gentle touches and whispered words. Two lonely people finding comfort in each other. It had been beautiful and surprising and completely unplanned. The next morning they had both been awkward about it, unsure how to navigate this new development in their arrangement. They had never talked about that night, never repeated it. Within a few days, they had settled back into their friendship routine as if it had never happened. Sarah had assumed Alexander regretted it, and she had been too embarrassed to bring it up. Now, sitting in the hospital examination room, she realized why Alexander had been distant lately. He must have figured out the timing too. "Sarah?" Dr. Martinez's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you all right?" "I need to go home," Sarah said numbly. "I need to talk to my husband." The drive home passed in a haze. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind spinning with questions and fears. How could she raise a child in a marriage that was supposed to end in 18 months? What would Alexander say when he found out? Would this ruin everything they had built together? By the time she reached the house, she had worked herself into a state of near panic. She found Alexander in his study, reviewing surgical notes on his computer. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and his expression immediately shifted to concern. "Sarah? You look pale. Are you all right?" She stood frozen in the doorway, unable to find the words. Alexander rose from his chair and moved toward her, his medical training kicking in as he evaluated her appearance. "Sit down," he said gently, guiding her to the leather chair across from his desk. "What happened? Did something go wrong at the hospital today?" Sarah looked up at him, this man who had become so important to her, and felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Alexander, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Alexander went completely still, his face unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. 6 weeks, Sarah whispered, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Alexander sank back into his chair, running both hands through his hair. The night after the Morrison surgery, he said quietly. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. I know this complicates everything. I know this isn't what either of us planned. Complications, Alexander repeated, but his tone was strange, almost wondering. Sarah, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his, expecting to see regret or anger. Instead, she saw something that took her breath away. Are you happy about this? He asked softly. The question surprised her. Was she happy? She was terrified and confused and completely unprepared for motherhood. But underneath all that fear was something else. A warm, fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with logic. I think I am, she whispered. Is that crazy? Alexander leaned forward, taking her hands in his. If it is, then we're both crazy because I think I am too. Sarah stared at him in shock. You are? Sarah, that night 6 weeks ago, it wasn't just comfort or loneliness, at least not for me. Alexander's voice was careful, vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. I've been trying to pretend it didn't mean anything because I was scared of what it might mean for our arrangement. But I can't pretend anymore. What are you saying? Alexander was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I'm saying that somewhere along the way, this stopped being an arrangement for me. You stopped being a convenient wife and became Sarah, the woman who makes me coffee exactly the way I like it, the woman who listens to my worst days and somehow makes them better, the woman who's creating something beautiful for sick children because that's who she is. Sarah felt her heart racing. Alexander, I know this changes everything, he continued. I know we agreed to 2 years and then freedom for both of us. But I need you to know that if you'll have me, really have me, not just as part of a contract, I want to try to make this marriage real. I want to raise this child together. I want to build a life with you. The tears were flowing freely now, but they were different tears. Tears of relief and hope instead of fear. What about your grandmother's money? Sarah asked. What about the inheritance? Alexander smiled, and it was the first genuine, unguarded smile she had seen from him since their wedding day. My grandmother called me yesterday. Apparently she's been watching us at social events and she's decided that our marriage has become real enough to satisfy her requirements. The inheritance is secure. She knew all along, didn't she? Sarah said, thinking back to their lunch at the club. Probably. She has a way of seeing through people's pretenses. She also has a way of manipulating situations to get the outcome she wants. Sarah laughed through her tears. She orchestrated this whole thing, didn't she? The lunch, the questions about our happiness when it's possible, Alexander admitted. She's been telling me for months that I needed to stop hiding behind my work and let someone care about me. He reached out and gently wiped a tear from Sarah's cheek. So what do you say? Are you willing to try to make this real? To see if we can build something together that's worth more than money or convenience? Sarah looked into his eyes and saw her future there. Messy and uncertain and nothing like what she had planned, but full of possibility. She thought about the child growing inside her, who would have parents who chose to love each other instead of just going through the motions. Yes, she whispered. I want to try. Alexander leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. We're going to have a baby, he said wonderingly. We're going to have a baby, Sarah repeated, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, she felt joy instead of fear. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering the world in a blanket of fresh starts and new possibilities. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the completed therapeutic garden, watching 3-year-old Emma Martinez carefully water the butterfly garden under her grandmother's supervision. The little girl had been Dr. Martinez's first patient to use the garden during her treatment for leukemia, and she was now in full remission. The garden had exceeded everyone's expectations. Children in wheelchairs could navigate the wide pathways between raised beds filled with herbs and flowers. The sensory garden provided textures and scents that helped distract young patients from their pain. The quiet reading nook under the cherry tree had become a favorite spot for families to spend time together away from the clinical hospital environment. But what made Sarah proudest was watching how the garden brought people together. Parents found comfort in tending the plants while their children underwent treatment. Siblings had a place to play that didn't feel scary or medical. Staff members used their breaks to sit among the flowers, finding moments of peace in their demanding days. Mrs. Hartwell? A voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah turned to see Jennifer, Alexander's secretary, approaching with a tablet in her hands and a familiar expression of organized efficiency. The photographer from Boston Magazine will be here in 20 minutes for the feature story, Jennifer said. And Dr. Hartwell asked me to remind you about dinner with his grandmother tonight. Sarah smiled. Tell him I'll be ready. And Jennifer? You don't have to call me Mrs. Hartwell when it's just us. Sarah is fine. Jennifer's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine warmth. Sarah, then. Can I say how lovely it is to see you and Dr. Hartwell so happy together? The change in him this past year has been remarkable. After Jennifer left, Sarah sat on one of the garden benches and reflected on how much had changed since that snowy night, when she told Alexander about the pregnancy. Their relationship had transformed gradually, built on daily choices to care for each other and the life they were creating together. The early months had been challenging. Learning to live as a real couple instead of polite strangers required patience and honesty that neither of them had expected. They had disagreed about everything from baby names to nursery, colors to whether Sarah should continue working on the garden during her pregnancy. But they had learned to talk through their differences, instead of retreating into separate spaces. Alexander had surprised her by being overprotective during her pregnancy, worrying about every symptom and insisting she rest more than necessary. Sarah had discovered that beneath his controlled exterior, he felt emotions deeply and had simply never learned how to express them safely. Their daughter, Lily Rose Hartwell, had arrived on a perfect spring morning 6 months ago. Alexander had cried when he held her for the first time, this tiny person who represented the family he had never expected to have. Sarah had watched him become a father with the same dedication he brought to his surgeries, careful, thorough, and completely devoted. There's my beautiful wife, Alexander's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to see him approaching, still wearing his surgical scrubs but with baby spit up on his shoulder that he probably didn't realize was there. How's Lily? Sarah asked as he sat beside her on the bench. Perfect. Maria has her completely spoiled already. Alexander smiled, the expression that had once been rare now appearing frequently throughout his days. She refused to nap unless I read her the entire botanical encyclopedia you gave me. I think she's going to be as plant-obsessed as her mother. She's 6 months old, Alexander. She just likes the sound of your voice. Are you suggesting my daughter doesn't have advanced intellectual interests? He asked in mock offense. Sarah laughed, the easy intimacy between them still sometimes surprising her. I'm suggesting your daughter has you completely wrapped around her tiny finger. Guilty as charged. Alexander reached over and took Sarah's hand, his thumb tracing over her wedding ring. Not the original one from their arrangement, but the one he had given her 6 months into their marriage when they decided to start over with new vows. Are you nervous about the magazine interview? He asked. Sarah considered this. A year ago, she would have been terrified at the thought of being featured in a major publication. But the woman she had become, mother, garden designer, doctor's wife who had found her own identity, felt ready to share their story. Not nervous exactly, she said. Just aware that once this is published, people will know our marriage didn't start as a love story. But it became one, Alexander said simply. That's what matters. The photographer arrived shortly after, a young woman who was charmed by the garden and enthusiastic about capturing both its beauty and its purpose. She took pictures of Sarah among the flowers, of children playing in the space, and finally of Sarah and Alexander together beside the fountain at the garden's center. Can you tell me how this project came about? The photographer asked as she worked. Sarah and Alexander exchanged a glance, a whole conversation passing between them in a moment. My wife saw a need, and had the expertise to fill it, Alexander said. She created something that helps children heal, which is really what both of our careers are about. It started as a way to contribute something meaningful, Sarah added. But it became so much more. This garden represents what's possible when you combine medical care with attention to the human spirit. Later that evening, they sat in Mrs. Hartwell Sr.'s elegant dining room, sharing stories about Lily's latest developments. The old woman had become a devoted great-grandmother, insisting on weekly dinners and spoiling the baby with beautiful handmade clothes and toys. I have something to tell you both, Mrs. Hartwell said, as dessert was served. I've decided to establish a foundation for therapeutic gardens at children's hospitals. Sarah, I'd like you to oversee the program. Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Mrs. Hartwell, that's incredibly generous, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to— Nonsense, the old woman interrupted. You've proven what's possible with this project. Other hospitals are already inquiring about replicating your design. It's time to think bigger. Alexander squeezed Sarah's hand under the table. It would mean traveling to other cities, consulting on new gardens, he said. Are you interested? Sarah thought about the children she had met in the past year, the families who had found comfort among her flowers. The idea of creating more spaces like this, of helping children across the country, was both exciting and daunting. I'd need to finish my botany degree, she said slowly, and find childcare for when I travel. Maria would love to watch Lily more, Alexander said, and I could adjust my surgery schedule to be home more when you're away. Mrs. Hartwell smiled with satisfaction. Excellent. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers. As they drove home that night, Lily sleeping peacefully in her car seat, Sarah marveled at the unexpected directions life could take. 2 years ago, she had been a woman selling flowers to pay her father's debts, trapped in a marriage of convenience with a man she barely knew. Now she was a mother, a garden designer with a national foundation to run, and most surprisingly, she was genuinely in love with her husband, not the desperate, uncertain love of her early 20s, but the deep, steady love that came from truly knowing someone and choosing them every day. Do you think we would have found each other if circumstances had been different? She asked Alexander as they pulled into their driveway. Alexander turned off the car and considered the question seriously. I don't know, he said honestly. I was pretty closed off before you. I might have stayed that way forever. And I might have stayed in my comfortable small world, never taking any risks. Maybe we needed the arrangement to push us together, Alexander said. Maybe we needed to start with a business deal because we were both too scared to start with our hearts. Sarah looked back at their sleeping daughter, then at the house that had become a real home filled with love and laughter. Your grandmother knew, she said with certainty. She knew we needed each other even when we didn't know it ourselves. Alexander laughed softly. She's probably listening to this conversation somehow, feeling very pleased with herself. As they carried their daughter inside and prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been forced to marry an arrogant millionaire doctor, expecting 2 years of polite coexistence. Instead, she had discovered that beneath Alexander's defensive walls was a man capable of deep love, extraordinary kindness, and the courage to build a family with someone who had started as a stranger. The woman who had once felt trapped in someone else's life had found her own purpose, her own voice, and her own happily ever after. It hadn't come the way she had expected, but it had come at exactly the right time, with exactly the right person. And as she fell asleep in Alexander's arms, with their daughter breathing softly in the nursery next door, Sarah knew that sometimes the best love stories were the ones that began with the most unlikely circumstances and grew into something neither person could have imagined alone.